Welcome to the Boone County History and Culture Center's Meet the Author program. Our goal is to provide conversations with Missouri authors who know a lot about Missouri. I'm David Weber. As soon as the pandemic is over, we will return to meeting in person at the History and Culture Center Saturday mornings at 10:30. But until then, I will use this Zoom technology to record interviews with authors who we might not otherwise hear from. Thank you to our sponsors, Simmons Bank, and the staff of the History and Culture Center for making this video possible. Today, our guest is Willoughby Johnson, author of Crosscut Creek, a year of fly fishing on an Ozark trout stream. Willoughby graduated from Rockbridge High School in 1988 and lives in Kansas City. For those of you who may not have viewed my previous interviews, he's the brother of Walter Johnson, a historian who I interviewed last fall, and was a neighbor of Pete Hessler, who I interviewed last month. I'm somewhat fascinated with how the Stewart Road neighborhood in Columbia has produced so many writers. Perhaps Willoughby and I will discuss that later. So welcome, Willoughby.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So before I get started about your book, let me review why your family is such a fixture in my mind. I came to the University of Missouri in August of 1986, and I moved into the political science building, and I moved all my books, moved the house, moved my kids, and I was exhausted. So one morning I go down there to eat at the McDonald's on campus, and the first person I talked to was Professor Walter Johnson of the economics department. So I talked to him for a while, and he asked me about my family and where we planned to live. I told him Edgewood Avenue. He proceeded to tell me what a great place it was and how important that neighborhood was, and I'm really show good judgment by moving to Edgewood Avenue. But this went on for a while, and then, as you can guess, sooner or later I asked him, well, where do you live? And he told me Edgewood Avenue. And then he told me about his two sons, and Walter, his name, I didn't remember very well. But when he said Willoughby, it's sort of unusual to me, so that stuck with me. A year later, my sons attended Children's House, which Mrs. Johnson, Mary Angela Johnson, owned and operated. And in the summer of '87, I can remember my son coming home telling me about this big boy, Willoughby, who was working at Children's House. So his name has always stuck me, and I was impressed that his mother had the foresight to hire some boys to be good role models. So then Willoughby, I guess the other thing I remember about your father is he used to drive a Jeep. And I'm wondering, was he an outdoors person? Is that how you became interested in this, or?
Yeah, my brother and I grew up more hunting than fishing. But my dad was an avid hunter and hunted actually in Africa, and then we hunted a lot in Missouri growing up. And I hunted into adulthood. But as I got older, I got a little soft-hearted, and the idea of catch and release fishing, where you were sort of hunting, but you didn't end up killing at the end, began to appeal to me, and I sort of made a transition from that hunting background that I'd really grown up with my dad to something different and my own, I guess.
So when did you first get into trout fishing, like you describe in this book? How old were you when you had that experience?
I mean, very slowly, and then all at once, I guess, which is a theft of a line from Hemingway. And the very slowly was, as a kid, I think like a lot of kids of my generation and boys of my generation, read Hemingway growing up, and that was sort of my entree into reading and into literature, and certainly went in a lot of different directions after that. But he obviously, one of his signature and great stories is the Big Two-Hearted River, which is a fly fishing story.
Hmm.
And so, um, as a high school kid, I tried to sort of teach myself to fly fish, and went on a couple of ill-fated fishing trips with a couple of my buddies, where I don't think we ever caught anything, and we drank a lot of beer. I think
Yeah.
that was
Yeah.
the main,
Yeah.
ended up maybe being the main focus. And so then I sort of sporadically fished, um, really in my late teens, and after I got back to the Midwest after college, fished a little bit. Um, but then, as I say, all the time I really was doing a lot of other outdoor stuff, in my
Mm.
20s and early 30s, but a lot of it revolved around hunting. And as I began to enjoy hunting less, and question it a little bit, um, at a certain point, and I talk about this in the book. At a certain point, um, a cousin of my wife's actually gave me a bamboo fly rod, um, and so that was sort of an inflection point where, I decided I wanted to learn how to use this rod and learn about fly fishing, and I began to the hunting began to be less and less, and the fishing began to be more and more
So
for me.
when would that have been? Like the mid 1990s or
No, that
2000?
would have been, I would say early 2000s. Yeah,
Huh.
yeah, or probably 2005 or six, I'd say.
Yeah. And then let me ask you, I really do enjoy this book, and I would encourage people or to purchase it, or to check out the local library.
Preferably
Let me ask you to
purchase.
read the first paragraph. Why don't you tell me how is it organized? Or if you had to explain this book to someone who hasn't read it, what would you tell them?
It's an incredibly simple organizational structure, which is it's just month by month. It's from January to December, monthly, if you will, entries, or reflections on what happens on the farm, um, each month. The farm, um, was about 185 acres in southern
Mm.
Missouri, um, and had a trout stream, running through it. And so it's about the seasons on the farm. It's about the fishing. It's about the landscape, the
Yeah.
people
Mhm.
in the area, and my family. We spent a lot of time down there as a family. But the organizational structure really is just month by month.
Yeah. So if you would you read the first paragraph to give us a sense of what it's, uh,
Sure,
the
you bet.
tone of it? Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Put on my glasses.
Yeah.
I lie on my belly to peer between pale shoreline grasses over the edge of a steep bank into the creek. The creek's not but 6 or 8 feet wide here, and the water's brilliantly clear, 6 or 7 inches deep, running fast and riffled over chunky stones before falling into white water and the slow eddy of the elbow below. A large trout, 12 or 13 inches long and big around as a baguette, hangs in the riffles facing downstream. Trout normally face upstream when they're resting in the water, but this trout isn't exactly resting.
Mm. So one feature of your book that I like very much is inside the cover. I guess it's a diagram of the farm.
Of the farm, right?
Is that I've never seen it before. I mean, anything like I've seen maps,
Right.
but not of a specific area like this with the names of these areas. So like a lot of the oh, verbiage is new to me. I'm not a fisher, but long pool and big springs, hidden meadow. I thought that was a great idea. How did you come to do this?
there's two ways. The first is that the book was originally published as an ebook by a company out in Connecticut, and I had friends and relatives, and one friend in particular who read the book and enjoyed the book, but it's a very you've got a couple hundred pages written about 185 acres, so it's there's still a geography there, um, and it's a very intimate geography, I guess, but there's still a geography of that farm. And he was saying that he sometimes didn't understand where he was, where he was placed. As early in the book, I try to sort of describe the farm and the creek going through it and the different features, but it's hard to, if you're 50 pages after that, it's hard to sort of place yourself. And so he said to me, he thought the book needed a map. The other answer to that is that it is Winnie the Pooh. If you recall, in Winnie the Pooh, it's just an amazing and delightful map in Winnie the Pooh of the 100-acre wood. And I always loved that map. And so part of the inspiration for this map, it's obviously not as lighthearted as Winnie the Pooh, but part of the inspiration for this map is the maps in Winnie the Pooh of 100-acre wood. But really, it serves. It was fun to do, and I think it's pretty in the book. The book, I think, itself is I think it's a pretty object, but it was really, it does serve a practical purpose, which is when you're reading, you sort of lose where exactly you are. You can hopefully go back there and kind of place yourself again where you are on the farm.
Yeah, I did find it very effective, and again, since the sort of the context or the biological setting is new to me, I found it very effective.
Right.
So, what about the name? I know what a crosscut saw is. How did you get? How did you choose the name of the creek?
As we've discussed, I mean, this is a real creek, and it's called Crane Creek. It's in southern Missouri, in Stone County, Missouri. I changed a few of the actual geographical names really at the time because I wanted to protect the place a little bit, because this was going to be a huge international bestseller, and you didn't want people, coming down. But most people, I mean, people who were anglers and people who were from Missouri sort of figured out that it was Crane Creek. But I changed the name sort of for that reason, and also some of the location names I changed just to give myself a little bit of flexibility as we talk. This is sort of creative nonfiction, and it's mostly nonfiction, but there's a little bit of creative in there, and so making it a fictionalized location just slightly allowed me a little bit of flexibility in my storytelling.
So tell me about trout fishing. My impression of it from movies like A River Runs Through It is that trout fishing has sort of this, it's very romantic, idyllic. I mean, it has a whole ethos to it, I guess.
Yeah.
How's it different than other fishing, for example?
Well, I think I mean, the romantic ethos, there are definitely moments of transcendence. But I also talk a lot in the book about there's a lot of, it can be enormously frustrating and infuriating as well. So I try not to idealize it too much, but on the other hand, I guess if I wrote several thousand words about it, I guess that in itself is an act of idealization. In terms of how it's different from other fishing, it's incredibly simple. I think the equipment is very simple. I mean, I think I talk about this in the book, that I mean, when I'm fishing with a bamboo fly rod, I mean, most of the materials that I'm using are in some ways Paleolithic. I mean, I'm using
Mhm,
the bamboo is something
mhm,
that grew. It's organic,
mhm,
and really, it's there's not a lot of mechanical assistance. I mean, the equipment
mhm,
essentially, the equipment I'm using when I'm fly fishing today is essentially unchanged for 100 and
mhm,
close to 150 years. So it has a real simplicity to it, which appeals to me, and I think appeals to most people who do it. But it's also one of those things that is incredibly simple and elemental, but also um, just has incredible layers of both of technique, and what you can do with this very simple object, and also a lot of layers. I think for people who do it, it has a lot of layers of meaning. The longer you do it, and the more it becomes your catalyst for connecting with nature.
mhm. And I did notice that, I don't know if environmental ethic is the right word, but you do have several instances throughout the book. Oh, planting trees
Right.
is one, and at the end of the book, picking up trash and
Yeah.
plastic jugs.
Yeah.
So you do have an environmental ethic that blended in. Was that
Yeah. I mean,
intentional or
no, very much so. I mean, one thing about trout specifically is or any cold water species, I mean, they're incredibly fragile, and incredibly vulnerable, and especially in a context of climate change, they're, you really can't be someone who fishes for trout or salmon or any sort of cold water species, and say that you care about those species and not care about the environment or care about climate change. And then the farm specifically, yeah, I mean, there is a big theme in the book, which is that the creek and the farm had been, heavily logged and heavily
or
grazed. So there was a lot of erosion, and so one of the, it, the creek corridor is called a riparian corridor, and one of the things we did, our time down there was spend a lot of time restoring that
mm,
corridor.
yeah,
We planted thousands and thousands of trees. We did a lot of rock work and other things to restore
oh,
eroded
that's right. Yeah.
areas. Um, so yeah, that's those things. I think they go hand in hand. I mean, being an angler and certainly a fly fisherman, I think if you're not also um, an environmentalist, then you're only
Mm,
half you're not complete
mm,
as an angler. You're not a complete angler.
mm.
So
So, how is the trout population in Missouri? Is it holding its own, or and I know they always stock. They seem to always stock
right.
streams. Why do
So
they do
there,
that?
there are great question. There are very few places in Missouri where trout naturally reproduce, where they spawn. And that's
Uh,
what that first paragraph of the book is about. Actually, is about the spawn of trout in
yeah,
January on on the creek. And that's one of the things that's very special about the creek is that it was one of the few places in Missouri where trout naturally
is that
reproduce.
right?
There are some others,
Mm,
but most of the trout in Missouri are stocked. It's cold water, spring-fed creeks in the Ozarks, but most of the trout are grown in hatcheries and then stocked. And so one of the things that's sort of special and miraculous about that creek and a few other places in Missouri is that they have naturally reproducing
mm,
stocks of trout. And I
mm,
mean, to your question of what's unfortunate, because there are so few of those places and people really want to fish there, um, those wild trout in Missouri, they get a lot of pressure, and so the populations continue, but they, in fishing parlance, you say that those little sections of water where there are wild trout reproducing, that you say that they get hammered. Those sections of creek get hammered because they just get a lot of fishing pressure and it's hard on the populations.
Yeah, yeah. And then all types of baits, bait legal. Like I remember, I get the impression that fishing, trout fishing with a worm is taboo or frowned upon. And then
I
you
mean,
talked about,
in Missouri, you can fish any method, and
mm,
people
mm,
do fish on. You're technically, I think, on most of these waters, you're not supposed to fish with what would be called live bait, like a worm. You can
live
fish
baits.
by a lot of different methods. Um, yeah, and I mean, I think it is considered taboo in some ways, and I think that's a shame in a lot of ways. I mean, um, to me, the thing that's a little more taboo on these wild rivers is especially the ones in Missouri, which are so few in number and get so much pressure. I mean, the bigger taboo is that, when people are fishing and then uh, killing fish and not doing catch and release. Um, there's a place for killing fish and eating them. That's great, but when they're quite um, special and rare, to me, that's a shame.
Mm. So, and then I noticed in one paragraph, which really stuck, that I got stuck on, I guess would be the word, is about catch and release.
Right.
I mean, I understand it, but it was thoughtful or thought provoking. If you look at page 77,
Yeah.
and you talk about fish, maybe you would read that paragraph if you would.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. It kind of undercuts what I just said, because we do talk about that catch and release fishing isn't always perfect, and that's kind of what this paragraph is about.
Mhm.
Catch and release fishing is a sort of death pageant, play acting at killing, all of the thing except the thing. Unfortunately, when you play at killing, the act sometimes becomes real. Fish die. It brings to mind the question of why we fish.
Mhm.
What compels us to wade in freezing water, endure what the mid century bon vivant, literary impresario, and fly fisherman Arnold Gingrich called its exquisite discomforts, to say nothing of its lonely humiliations, in order to inflict pain and suffering on incredibly delicate creatures we claim to revere.
So, have there been studies like how many do fish survive catch and release?
That's a great question, and there have been, and they do, but also a fair number of them do die. I mean, it depends, but I think a number that a lot of people go with is 5 to 10% of fish, even with catch and release, 5 to 10% of those fish will die.
Mm,
Um, Now, the other sort of nuance is barbed and barbless hooks, and I mean, you just can go on and on
mm.
and on
Well,
with
uh,
people trying to fish again, and that's the paradox, and people are trying to wrestle with this paradox of,
mm.
of wanting to fish and wanting to catch fish, but also not wanting to hurt fish, and it's almost impossible to do. I mean, there are people who now literally who fish with a fly and no hook. And so their whole thing is they fish and they want the fish to grab at the bait, but then they don't actually try to land the fish.
That's what I
Yeah.
wondered. So,
So,
uh, I shouldn't say too often how much I enjoyed this book, but
thank
it did motivate me to go to a trout stream. Um, is it Robineau
I'm not sure
Stream?
Rubidoux, maybe. I'm not sure the
Yeah,
pronunciation.
yeah,
Yeah.
down. I know it's by Fort Leonard Wood.
Right.
I went down there. I took a day trip, and I did talk to two fishermen and a bunch of kids actually.
Right.
But when I watched, and I wasn't sure he had a hook, to be honest with you, but I was not aware that that was a common experience.
Yeah.
Huh?
Well, I wouldn't say it's common, but there are people who do it. Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
And then one guy did. I talked to him in the parking lot on his way out. He had caught three that he had gutted, and he
Right.
was taking them home. Um, I I remember you talking about deer hunting
Yeah.
and dressing a deer. I don't remember you in this book mention anything about eating the fish.
No, I mean, because I didn't, I mean, again, and so the guy you would have seen at Rubidoux Creek was fishing for what are called stockers. They're stocked fish that were grown in a hatchery. So and that are, so the ethics of that and of catching and eating those fish are a little different. And I don't really have a
Mm,
problem with that. I mean, again,
mm,
the fish and this is what's so miraculous. And I talk about this in the book. I mean, the fish in Crosscut Creek and other naturally reproducing fish. I mean, you've got this tiny egg that and milt, which is the word for fish sperm, is called milt.
oh,
That have gotten together in a gravel bed and somehow they're now this thing that's 12 inches long.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
you're when you I mean you're touching the, you know, I mean, for lack of a better word, you're touching the almighty. I mean,
yeah,
when you land that fish, and it takes a lot of it takes a lot of chutzpah to kill that thing, I think.
yeah, yeah,
I mean, I think that it's Ray Bergman, who's one of the great fishing writers, and that's what he writes about in his book Trout. That he that's the book's called Trout.
mm,
Um,
mm,
that's what's meaningful to him about fishing is it's this. Um, it was his way to connect with the really big questions and the really big
mm,
um, forces that we don't fully understand or
yeah,
comprehend.
mm. So, and that's of course similar to that movie, A River Runs Through It, right? The
Right,
parallels between religion and and trout fishing.
right.
But is it always trout fishing? I mean, I caught a lot of bluegill when I was a kid, but that doesn't have the same mystique, I take it, as trout fishing
I
does.
mean, I think with trout fishing, I think the thing is, and this is a huge trout fishing cliche, but it's true, is that trout don't live in ugly places. And so
Ah,
usually when you're trout fishing or salmon fishing, it's sort of the whole package.
ah,
There's nothing fishing for bluegill is a lot of fun. There's nothing wrong with it, but I think sometimes with certain fish and where they are and where they live, it becomes in some ways maybe a more moving experience.
yeah.
Um,
And
the,
then I know you have two daughters,
right?
um, who you mentioned a couple times. Did they get involved in all this? Did they like to go to the farm?
They did. We would
Mm,
go to the farm a lot, and they both. The I wrote the time that the book is talking about is really 2013. So now pushing up against 10 years ago, and
ah, mm,
they were like little kids, and
mm,
now one's in college and one's a junior in high school, and
ah,
they're still. There's a lot in the book about fishing with my daughters, and you know beginning to teach them how to fly fish, and they're still both consider themselves anglers. And in
ah,
fact, we're planning a couple fishing trips right now. So
ah. So, so you fished other places then outside Missouri?
oh, I have, yes.
Yeah. So where have you been? I mean, to the Pacific Northwest
I,
a
I've
lot,
I've fished
Montana.
I fished I fished in Montana. I fished in
Oh,
Colorado, New Mexico, actually Argentina,
huh,
um, and then in Eastern Canada as well. Yeah, those
huh,
are. I'm hoping that maybe next spring the Pacific Northwest for the first time.
hmm,
Um, Actually, last fall I fished on the Blackfoot River in Montana, which was from a literary
huh,
fly fishing standpoint. That was Norman Maclean's river, and a river runs through it. So that was um, for somebody who cares about books and literature and cares about fly fishing, that was a cool sort of a pilgrimage.
Yeah. So let me ask you, how did you get into writing? I mean, looking back, are you surprised that you wrote this book, or did you expect to do this all your life?
I guess I'm surprised I wrote this book. I think eh, growing up, it's hard to remember now. I mean, it's hard to remember back to the 70s and 80s, when there was no internet, and living in Columbia, Missouri. You know, your window to the world was quite small. You had the Tribune and you had the Missourian,
Yeah.
and you had the library, and then maybe in the 70s that was kind of it, and you had three
Yeah.
TV channels.
Yeah, that's right.
And then early 80s there was cable TV came in, and there was a little widening of the window, and maybe I think in the mid 80s you could get the Sunday New York Times. But so as a kid, the window
Mm,
to the world was
mm,
books. That was what you had. And I think, as you talk about Pete Hessler and my brother and Jake Adelstein and some of those other guys, who I grew up with, who one way or another became writers. I think we became writers because we were readers,
mhm,
and we were readers because that was all we had. I mean, there was, that was your window to a wider world. And it's just, I mean, that's changed dramatically, since in our lifetimes. But as kids, I think all of us were readers, and I think that made us want to be writers in a lot of ways. It certainly made us admire writers, and um, so yeah, I think most writers begin as readers, and certainly
mhm,
that was my case. And I think I mentioned, I'm not sure if it was an earlier conversation, but you know, for me as a kid, and I think a lot of people my generation, as an adolescent, um, there were these. I There were a lot of writers I admired, but certainly Hemingway was one of them, and
mm,
he has a lot of stories, short stories in particular, about being in the outdoors. And I think one of his acknowledged masterpieces is Big Two Hearted River, which is about a fishing trip. Um, and so writing about the outdoors,
mm,
was always there. I mean, I've written a lot of other things, without a lot of worldly success, but yeah, I mean, writing was something from a very early age that writing in a sort of for lack of a better way of putting it, a literary vein, was something I started
yeah,
pretty young. Yeah.
so did you do journalism at Hickman? No, you went to Rockbridge.
I went to
Excuse me.
Rockbridge. No, I,
Sorry.
I didn't. I didn't do
Uh,
journalism.
uh,
I had some.
uh,
I had some stuff in the literary magazine, and worked on the
uh,
literary
uh,
magazine with. Uh, there were some
what-
great teachers there who,
yeah,
in various ways, were really helpful and encouraging. Um, Nancy Miller and Mrs. Shaw, whose first name I can't remember right off the top
yeah,
of my
sure.
head.
Uh,
And I think trying to remember who ran the anyway. Yeah.
and then I did see you had some articles in the Missouri Review
Right. I had some
that
short fiction there. Yep.
that I was not able to access without subscribing. What were the topics of that short fiction? I mean, related to
No,
fishing at all or
totally
anything?
unrelated. I mean, I'm trying to
Totally.
remember.
Mm,
One of the stories was about a girl's 16th birthday party. So that was about
huh?
as at a fancy house. So that was about as far away from this book as you could
Yeah,
get it.
yeah. Uh, huh.
I'm trying to remember what the other, right off the top of my head, the other stories, that were in the Missouri Review. I can't recall which ones. I know there's one they didn't publish that they should have, which was
Yeah.
about a letting a handgun off at a hotel. But I mean, so there, the
Uh,
point being, there's the fiction was very different from this book.
yeah,
Yeah, for sure.
yeah. So let me ask you, what do you do now? I know that you did, after college, you taught for a while, right?
Right.
In Kansas City?
Yep. And
Uh,
I work for a manufacturing company is how I make my crust,
yeah,
as we
yeah,
say. Um,
yeah.
but managed to still do some writing and
Yeah. What kind of topics are you interested in now? Do you do any politics or anything?
no, I mean I've written there's an online actually I'm honestly writing about fishing. I've
Oh,
I've
good.
I'm I
Good.
there's a an online angling magazine called MidCurrent,
Oh,
and they actually publish some excerpts from the book when it came out, and then um, I've written a couple things for them about fishing trips that I've taken, and so that's
mm,
I'm um, I'm having fun with that, and
uh,
I'm at this point devoid of any worldly ambition in the literary world, and so
uh, that's,
I'm able to just have fun, and
yeah,
that's actually really liberating.
yeah,
Having fun fishing and having fun writing about it.
yeah.
Um, so
So, do you have any recollections of fishing in Boone County? Where should, where did you fish when you lived here?
um, not a few times in high school. We'd go to a pond and fish for bluegill and that kind of thing. Um, but
A
for me,
farm pond,
honest,
like
I'm sorry.
a farm
Yeah,
pond?
farm
That's,
ponds and that kind of thing.
yeah.
Um, but for me, and again, I guess this does get back to, some of the Hemingway that I was reading as a kid, whether, Sun Also Rises or Big Two-Hearted
Mm,
River, um, in those books, which were definitely my first um, entree into wanting to fish, and it was always trout, and so trout and the cold water species have always been what I was interested in, and that's not something really you can do in Boone County. Um,
yeah, that's it. Uh,
yeah.
well, I'm trying to think, is there anything else we should discuss about,
No, I don't think so. I mean, that's kind of gives us a good view into the book, I think, and yeah.
well, thank you very much, Willoughby, and I hope
No,
people
I
check it out.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you so much.